Okay, let's get started. Hi, we've got a pretty full hour ahead, so why don't we start it up? Welcome to our presentation on the iterative level design process for Bioware's Mass Effect 2. First, some quick housekeeping. You've probably heard this a number of times. If you have cell phones, could you please turn them off? And feedback forms, evaluations, please fill them out. We'd like to know if you like the presentation or what you'd have us change. For some quick introductions, my name is Cory Andrusko. I'm a project manager at Bioware. I'm PM on Mass Effect 2. I was a project manager on Bring Down the Sky, which was the first DLC content for Mass Effect 1. And I was a project manager on Mass Effect 1. And my co-presenter today, Dusty Everman, is the lead level designer on Mass Effect 2. He was the lead designer for Bring Down the Sky, and he was the lead technical designer for Mass Effect 1. And he also has some cinematic design experience from Jade Empire. And is in fact the architect, by the way, of the different phases for the level design process we're going to discuss with you today. So iteration on our levels is a very valuable thing. It's something we want to embrace because it's what makes our levels better. It's what helps us elevate our game to that bar that we set for ourselves. But it can be very costly depending on how we implement it. So if you could leave with just one takeaway, the message we'd want you to have would be this. And that is to do only the work that answers the right questions in the right order. Because everything else that you do that you could iterate on represents added risk to your project and potentially increased cost, extended schedule. You may have to reduce your scope, all those levers that you potentially have to pull as a project manager to solve. Now, this seems pretty straightforward, and so we ask, well, why don't we just do this all the time? And I think it's because we very frequently work on very complex games, very complex projects with a lot of concurrent issues that we're trying to resolve all at once. It can be very hard to stay focused and keep it simple. So today we want to show you our solution to this problem and walk you through some of our experiences. So first we're going to start with the why a new level design process. And what that really is level design on Mass Effect 1. So we'll show you how we did that and what some of the problems were that we ran into as a result. Then we're going to look at the what. Well, what is our solution? And that's the theory of the Mass Effect 2 level design process at the different phases, what the questions are that we want to answer for each phase, and what the deliverables are that represent the answer to each of those phases. And we're going to show you some video to illustrate the differences. And then we're going to discuss the how. Well, how is it going? Because we've been living this for about a year now, and we want to talk about, well, how we implemented it from a production perspective and how is it going. And then finally, we're going to conclude by reflecting back on Mass Effect 1 and ask the question, do we think that this new level design process would have been effective or bring any value on Mass Effect 1, given that it was a new IP, and we know that we're applying it now on a sequel. So, and then finally, we'll have a little bit of time for question and answer at the end. So if you have any questions, please save them for the end. And with that, I'm going to pass you over to Dusty Everman.
Thank you, Cory. So the level design process we're going to present today is what we're using on Mass Effect 2, but it comes from the lessons we learned by doing Mass Effect 1. So it makes sense that we kind of talk about first, how did we design levels on the original Mass Effect? But before we get started, it's better to, instead of talking about what we did, it's kind of important to know who did the work because every studio has its own division of responsibilities. At Bioware, we strive to make the best story-driven games in the world. So kind of at our core are our writers. They handle our plots, they decide who the characters are, they write the dialogue. We have level artists who, especially on Mass Effect 1, they were very much jack of all trades. They would do our modeling, our texturing, our lighting, materials, and they were also responsible for the layout of our levels. We would have our cinematic animators that would do our high-end cutscenes. And we had cinematic designers who would handle all the camera work and animations in the dialogues that we have in our game. Last but not least, we would have our technical designers who would do all the scripting for the combats and script up the plots. And they were responsible for taking all of the different assets from everyone else and putting them in the level. Now, this is what we had for Mass Effect 1. And it's pretty much what we have for Mass Effect 2 as well, with a very slight change, is that we've kind of taken some of the responsibility of the layout from the level artists and moved it down to the technical designers. So we now call them level designers. That's why lead level designer. And we might use them interchangeably in this presentation about technical designer equals level designer. And you might notice this is obviously not everyone that's involved in making games, programmers, QA, character modelers, animators. But what we're focusing on here is just level creation. So these are the people that actually are putting the content in the levels and thus are stepping on each other's toes. So on ME1, we started off with a writer thinking of the plot of the level, what the story is through the level. And they would decide who the characters are, and on paper and pencil, they'd go in and make a little 2D map as to what the flow was. That would flow into, they would get together with their level artist, who would then make a more elaborate map. Though it's still on paper, it's still two-dimensional, just paper and pencil. And that would then go to all the vision holders and get reviewed and say, yep, that looks like a level that we want to do. At that point, the level artist would go in and make a very simple block level. It would be an engine, but it's empty, but it would just kind of give a feeling for like, okay, I guess this is how we're going to go through the level. And that would get signed off. That was the point where the real work started, is that everyone would then go off and do their own discipline. You'd have the level artists come in and make the level pretty. You'd have the writers go and start writing dialogue, which would then get passed on to the cinematic designers who would do their camera work. Separately, you'd have the cinematic animators doing the cutscenes off on their own. The tech designers would go in and start scripting up the combats, and as assets would come down the pipe, they would put them in the level and get things working. Then at the very end, we would go and optimize for performance. So that idea of everyone doing their own job is a silo mentality, where you focus on the discipline. Art focuses on art, right? Writing focuses on writing, and it's not necessarily in the context of the level. This works very well if you know the work that you have to do. You can just, focus, crank out content. It's very good for that. But that makes the assumption that all the pieces are going to fit together at the end, which isn't necessarily the best assumption. This is game design, which is art, not science, and therefore you never really get it right the first time. You kind of have to iterate and try things out over and over again. It also kind of meant that the deliverables that people were working on weren't necessarily judged in the context of the level. A cutscene might just be viewed on a PC screen in a Bink. Writing might even be judged just in the dialogue editor and not in the level. Now what this meant is iterations with one silo would have these hidden costs in other silos. And what I mean by that is, for example, you can make a narrative change that would cause a geometry change. There's a character now that needs a new room or a new door or somewhere to walk through. A geometry change can affect scripting. Is that all of a sudden the floor moved a little bit, everyone's embedded in the floor, they're in the wall, and you've got to move stuff around. You could have a scripting change that affects cinematics. Somebody moved some cover because it made the combat better, but the animators were relying on that to be a very integral piece of the scene. And on and on and on. So what this does is it has a rippling rework effect, that iteration in one silo then unexpectedly causes iteration in another silo as they fix all of their things. So what's the impact? Like I said, the iterations become very costly. And worse yet, they're kind of unplanned. You never know when you're going to have to do some more work because something comes down the pipe and it's like, oh, crap, I got to deal with that. It also didn't really encourage communication between departments. It's kind of human nature. You focus on the work you need to get done, and you don't necessarily think like, oh, yeah, what I'm doing here could actually affect someone else. Maybe I should go talk to them. It's just not in the forefront of your mind. And you would have intractable performance issues. Things that might work in isolation, when it all came together, may not run at frame rate, may not be within memory. If you know Mass Effect, that may be something we're not 100% proud on. And it wasn't because we didn't try to fix those performance problems and frame rate hitches and such. It was just the way to fix it would have been redoing complete swaths of content. And kind of the most important thing from this was that our levels were rarely playable, and that's because you had a lot of different fingers in the pot, and anyone could break the level. So the stars really had to align for you to be able to sit down and play from the level from beginning to end. It was only towards the end of the project that we could actually do that. And that had some real large impacts. If we had new game mechanics coming down the pipe, a new system or a new creature or something like that, they couldn't really be tested in level because the levels weren't runnable. So they would get tested off in test levels, which test level does not equal a real level. And then that just means there's problems that you discover later on. It really hindered our quality assurance team. How can they give feedback on a level? How can they test a level if the level's broken? All they can do is tell you it's broken. It's broken. And until the very end, only then can they start giving you some good feedback. And most important, the content tend to be reviewed towards the very end. And that's by the vision holders, our project director, our lead designer, our lead artist, the people that really say, hey, this has to be fixed. And by the time they could play it and review it and make the course corrections, so much work had been dumped into a level that there would be large amounts of rework. And sometimes the amount of rework was actually more than what we had left in the schedule, and then that means you have to cut content. Cut content that was very expensive because people had done a lot of work already. Kind of our prime example was the planet Calliston. I don't know if you're familiar with Mass Effect 1. There's a planet where you go and you get your henchman Liara, and it's this little small world. And the original plan was it was going to be like the other plot worlds, where there would be a hub which would have its own stories and things that you would resolve before you would move on to the second half and go do what you really needed to do. In this case, it was kind of like an Outland. There was unions and cartels and refinery and such. But it turned out there were some level layout problems with it, there were some story problems with it, and it was just too much for us to actually get it to be the quality that we need. So we actually had to cut it. So now we come to ME2. What did we learn? And what we thought, what we need to do is get answers to our critical questions early and only do the work that's required to get those answers. Don't do anything more. And we had some basic premises that we're going to stick to. That is, the level should always be playable. If there's a bug in the level that blocks it from being played, fix it right now. We just get it up and running. All the games should be playable all the time. All the work we do should be a foundation, meaning that the work we put in should be the first step that can be built on for the second step, which can be built onto the third step, and minimize as much as possible anything that's just there to kind of represent something that gets torn out and redone. Always build from a foundation. And always keep it performance. When the performance creeps in, when your frame rate starts dipping, if you're having memory problems, fix them then and there. Don't wait until the very end. So how we do this is through some level creation phases. Each one of these has a very specific set of deliverables. And once you get to the stage, we have all of the vision holders. We put the level up on the wall by a projector. We play through it. Everyone then gives their feedback there, and you can only move on to the next stage until everyone's on board and everyone agrees. There's 5 stages. It's 6 if you count the first one. That's why it's called Phase 0, is that it's actually a document. It's not the level yet. And some of our terminology is a little bit, it's kind of organic. It was a historic thing. It's kind of grew as we were building. So we have a white box stage, for example. We'll talk about the details of it, but I'm sure white box means a lot of things to a lot of people. We'll describe what we mean by white box. We have an orange box stage, which we did borrow from Valve. And it was not from their great game. It was actually from a Gamma Sutra article that they had before then, talking about a collision-only level. So we kind of borrowed that. So thank you very much, Valve, if anyone's out there. So our very first phase, narrative overview. The question that we're asking is, what is the story? That's our focus at Bioware. And our deliverable is just a document. It describes what the narrative will be, describes who the characters will be in there, so the modelers can start scoping their work. It still has the 2D paper layout of like, okay, this is kind of what the level might look like. We define what the art themes are, so the level artists can start scoping their work. And we describe what cutscenes will be in it, so the animators can scope their work. This may seem very much like the very first step in Mass Effect 1, but there's a fundamental difference. Instead of the writer off by himself deciding all of this stuff, we actually would get all of the stakeholders together in a room. So you've got your animator, your level designer, the level artist. Everyone's in there giving their ideas, saying what would work for their own discipline. Everyone agrees on it, and then we produce the document that then gets signed off on to say, yep, that sounds like it's going to be a good mission. We move on to our narrative playable. The question here is the pacing and spacing of the level good. The deliverable is our very first playable. This is the moment where forevermore the level will be playable from beginning to end. It's a very simple box level geometry. We just go in, slam some stuff. It just kind of gives the feeling of what the sizes of the rooms might be. It's all about getting it done very quickly. And along with that box level, we have some concept art. And you look at the concept art, and then you kind of look at the geometry, and you can kind of imagine, okay, that's what the level's going to be. And the focus is, well, what are you going to go through in the level? Where will the combats be? Where will the dialogue be? Where are the lulls? So you can get your peaks and valleys and start seeing them in a very simple way. We put in our set pieces, art set pieces. If there's anything that we're kind of writing a check for the level artist to make something look spectacular, we kind of have a placeholder there so everyone agrees, yep, we're going to have to do that work. And we have box-level dialogues. This was a really great step for us. And what I mean by box-level dialogues, it's kind of analogous to the geometry, is that you'd have characters there, and you talk to them, but they don't say what they're going to say. It describes what they're going to say at a very high level. So you wouldn't have the real words of, hello, player, I'm glad to see you. Why don't you go do this and that and that? It would just say, this character will tell the player to do plot A, B, and C. It's something that writers can do very, very quickly. That's the theme of this, is we can usually do, with our iterations, get a level done within a week and just say, good, there to go. So it's all about the writer jumps in, but it's a foundation. They're actually in the real dialogue files and building from it. So magically, those box-level dialogues turn into real dialogues. And our cutscenes are just handled by pop-ups. It's just a text, but it's very representative of a cutscene. A cutscene pulls the play away from the player, and they watch a little something. Well, now a pop-up takes control away from the player, and you read it. So it gives you that idea of pacing. If our level had anything that was special, that's like a mechanic that's only in that level, we'd also go in and prototype it just to make sure that it's going to work, because it's probably important to the story there or the gameplay. So we'd make that at that stage. Turns out this is where our levels would get blown up the most. This is where people would go crazy and say, I don't like that. This needs to get changed. As a matter of fact, let's start all over from scratch. And that was a good thing, because like I said, it's a focus on just getting stuff in there quick within a week. And what was very interesting, we discovered, a lot of the stuff that would get blown up was stuff that should have been caught at the narrative overview. But there's just something about putting it up on the wall, watching it, that you really see the problems. I think our best example was over Christmas, everyone got to take the game home to play. And we had our end game that was good. It was at narrative playable, and it was really good. It was trending very well. But when we played the whole game, we realized at the very end, it's like, this isn't capping off the story the way it's supposed to. So when we got back, it was like, we started from scratch. Now, the end game was a little bit larger than other levels, so we probably lost a man-month. It was one guy that worked for about a month on it. But that's insignificant. It may sound like that was nothing compared to the quality gain that we just got out of that. And it was like, thank goodness. Then we move into white box. And here the question we're trying to answer is, can you see the fun? If the level is fun, then obviously you can see the fun. But it doesn't have to be fun at white box. At this stage, it's just you got to use your imagination and say, yes, this is trending well. The fundamental deliverable we have is representative collision. It's not the real collision, but you start getting a feel for where the walls really are, where the doors really are, where the flanks really are. It's getting close. We have box-level geometry that the level designer will work through to get to that point. And then at the very end, before being signed off on white box, the level artist comes in and does the first pass of the modeling. The writer will do their first pass of the dialogue. So it's real dialogue now of the characters, though it's the writer's first pass, but we haven't done the iterations that we know will happen to make second pass writing. But it's in there. Our combat is what I call bronze level. We don't have real collision at this point. It's just representative collision. Therefore, we can't go in and do all of our cover passes and pathing because then everything will move, we know, and that's not building on a foundation. But you get enough in there that you can get a feel for that. Okay, this is where the combat's going to be, and it's kind of going to flow like this, and you get a good idea. And our cutscenes are in an animatic form. If there's characters, there's just mannequins sliding around. But it's now something that you kind of understand what the camera shots might be and the length of it and what's being communicated. At this point, we put in placeholder music, which you might say, because our philosophy here is push everything off that doesn't answer the question that you're trying to do. And here we're saying, can you see the fun? And it's like, well, why does music relate to fun? I mean, that's more a quality thing and an immersive thing. But what we discovered is that if we didn't have music in a level, when you're playing it, you go like, this isn't very exciting. This just isn't doing it. I think we need to add a little something. And we need to add a little bit of this. But the moment you brought music in, you have some exciting combat music, everyone's like, yeah, nice, good, great. So we put it in early so we make sure that we don't do reworks, that we don't have to. It's actually just makes it more solid. That's the importance of audio. God, audio is important. We move into Orange Box. Now we say, is it fun? To get through Orange Box, the level's got to have some fun in it. It's got to be there. And our deliverable here is that we have actual collision. The artist will now come in. It's untextured geometry, so it's not the prettiest thing, but it's the real collision in the level. We've had our second pass on dialogue, so it's ready for VO, because once you send off for VO, it is really expensive to change. So now we've been able to play the dialogue a bit before we send it off. That enabled the cinematic designers to start blocking out the conversations. No, these are going to be the camera shots. These are going to be the animations we're going to use. When we move up to silver combats, we now are able to put in a full cover placement because we've got real collision, and therefore we can start blocking out where our battle fronts are, where the real flanks are, and do our first pass of the fun dialogue. Combat. And for cutscenes, they come in and do their basic mocap. So now you're getting a very crude cutscene, but you get a real good feel for what it's going to be. We move into hardening. And our question here is, could this be shipped? And we're not asking, should it be shipped? No. This is more, the way to think about it is, if you had to ship the game tomorrow, go gold for everything, but there was one level that was at hardening, would you push off your ship date, or would you say, nope, it's good enough? And that's what we mean by shipped. If there was one level that was just at hardening, but we're like, no, we can't afford to ship or push off our ship date, we'd go for it. So that means we've got a quote-unquote finished level. It's got everything. It's textured and lit. The dialogue's been VO'd and it's in. The cinematic designers have done their work and it's looking good. The combats are now fully scripted, all the AI, all the paths, all the covers in its proper place. The cutscenes are looking smooth. They're looking good. And we've got the real music and audio in place at this point. So that leads us into our last phase, which is the finaling. And the question is, can you feel the awesome? This is the level you want to ship. The final level, balanced, polished, it's playing great. So that's the one you're proud of. And so we've scheduled that amount of time to make sure we can make the levels the best they can be. So the best way to understand the different level process is to kind of see it a little bit in action. So what I put together is a couple little short videos. One of them's the combat one, and what you'll see is a migration of a one level as it went from stage to stage, and it'll just kind of morph from each phase.
Can we drop the lights?
Oh yeah, can we drop the lights? So this is narrative playable. The idea here is just spacing. The enemies won't fight back, won't shoot back. Whoa, it's loud. You move into White Box. These enemies now they don't have proper cover, but you kind of get the idea of what they're doing. It's just kind of like, can you see the fun? We move into Orange Box. It's real collision, so the player and the enemies have their actual cover. The breakdown of the different enemies are in place, so you know who you're going to fight. But yeah, it's fun. It's starting to get fun, but you haven't really done much of the real scripting yet. Then you go into hardening. Now there's been tuning. There's real AI. It's kind of hard to tell in a video, but the enemies are acting differently. The flanks are more in place. The dead zones are more in place. You can actually see how it's really working. And unfortunately, we don't have any example of the last phase because we're actually not there yet. We haven't been able to we haven't gotten to the point where we're polishing the levels to finish. We still got some time out. The next video I have now displays kind of more the dialogue and cutscene part of the game. And I've done it a little bit differently. Now instead of it morphing as you go along, it's kind of like you'll see a piece and we'll return to the same piece and we'll go back again and watch it as it goes through its different forms. Still being lights on. Narrative playable. If you can see, these aren't the words the character would say. It just describes what the character would say. But it's the real character and it's the real dialogue file that's being played. And there's a cutscene. It just pops up, tells you what it is. It's like, oh, okay, there's going to be a cutscene here. We then move into White Box, which has the animatics. We also use text-to-speech to because we had the first pass writing, so you'll hear a little bit of Stephen Hawking action coming up. But it definitely gives you the idea of the flow of what's going to be there, and it lets you judge.
I'm not saying it'll be easy, but you don't have any options. So, this assassin, you planning to stop him?
Now, you see these procedural cameras. When we go into Orange Box, the cinematic team now is able to block them out.
There you are. You'll have to make your way up the second tower and cross the bridge to the penthouse. She'll fight you every step of the way, but it's your best chance. Hold on. Don't linger too long. They'll be here to greet you soon enough.
And then we move into hardening, which has everything. I'll just let you watch it because it's kind of fun.
The towers are heavily guarded and find no resistance closer to the penthouse. So, this assassin, second tower and cross the bridge to the penthouse. Her mercs will fight you every step, but it's your best chance. Hold on.
So you might have noticed there's no, once again, the last phase, we're not done yet. So it looks good, but it's actually all the artists involved are like, no, it's not polished enough yet, don't show it. But yeah, so it's going to be even better. So that's our process. That's what we strive for. We don't always are able to hit it, but Cory's going to talk about how the process is working for us, what's going good, what's going bad.
Thanks, Jesse. Now that we've gotten past those videos, let's get to the real fun, which is lean manufacturing. Okay. So, all right, we'll just do a quick comparison because it's actually very relevant for us. Just for anyone who isn't familiar with lean manufacturing, it was made popular by the Toyota production system, and its focus is on the identification and elimination of waste, and this is very, very relevant for what we're doing. So in lean manufacturing, there's a concept called the 3 M's, and the first M is muda. I'm sorry for my pronunciation if I'm getting that wrong. Loosely translated, it's really looking at waste from non-value-added work, and non-value-added to the player for us. And that really represents exactly what our message is, which is only do the work that we're willing to iterate upon. The next M is muri, and refers to waste through overburden, or waste from overstressing the system. And we try to resolve that in 2 different ways. One is through time boxing, and the other is load balancing. Now, a time box is a unit of time, or a value in time, that we're willing to invest in a specific amount of content. Now, load balancing, we try not to load balance if it's between our level creation teams, because what we find is if we pass levels between teams, there's this natural unwinding of work that occurs. As a new team picks it up, they want to find what's a hook for that level, what makes it really fun, and they want to unwind some of that work to make it their own. And we want to try to avoid that if at all possible. So if we need to load balance, we'll try and pass it around to members within a team. The third M is mura, and it refers to waste through variation. And what it's really talking about is waste through not standardizing good processes. And essentially, having the established deliverables that we strive for at each phase as our answer to the question is how we standardize. Another important concept from Lean is Kaizen, and loosely translated means wisdom through learning or wisdom through schooling. And what it's really speaking to is a continuous improvement plan. Now, continuous improvement is pretty important for us, and I think that old adage of if it ain't broke is arguably outdated, maybe particularly in game development, because the best way to get passed by your innovative competitors is to stand still. So we try to address continuous improvement through these 3 things. The first is, level reviews. Because at each phase of a level, we need to know, do we need to continue to iterate on it, or can we get it signed off? And what we find as we're doing our level reviews is very frequently it raises the bar in quality. So we may see something like a new use of Z, or maybe alternate paths, and we'll say, yes, that is a new standard for our levels. We want all of our levels that haven't yet reached this phase to implement to that quality level. Of course, any level that's already been approved at that phase, we don't want to unwind their work, and we'll address that as much as we can in the polishing phase at the end. The second method that we'd address continuous improvement is peer reviews. And unlike level reviews, peer reviews are one-time events that occur when that department's work is in the level for real. So for level design, that would be at orange box. For writing, that would be at white box, for example. And again, unlike level reviews, peer reviews are subject matter experts that deep dive the details of that department's work in a level. Now, both of those address quality and trying to always continuously raise our level of quality throughout our process. The third one, the level design mindshare meetings, for example, that Dusty's team would have or departments would have on their own, really tries to address how do we improve how we build the levels. And at their weekly meetings, what they will look at are what are the issues that they're being impacted by right now, and it's a good forum for them to roll out new practices and new standards. We're going to compare ourselves to Agile and Scrum, so we'll just review some terms very quickly so we're all on the same page. If I say backlog or product backlog, It's the list of prioritized functionality that you want to have in your game. It's not the full laundry list of items that will be in your game. It's the stuff that you haven't done yet that you're going to still work on. A sprint is a fixed period of time within which a team's goals can't change. So a team would take on some work within this period of time, and no one's allowed to go and change that goal. A sprint review is, well, at the end of that sprint, you need to determine is that work approved or are you going to iterate upon it? And that's what a sprint review is. And finally, a time box. We mentioned what a time box was, that unit in time for how much we're willing to invest in a specific amount of content. So overall, the Mass Effect 2 project is Scrum. I mean, we very clearly are Scrum. We have multiple different Scrum teams. We have multiple releases through our project. We have multiple sprints within our releases, and we take on overall project goals for each release, broken down into sprints by our teams. For level design, sprint planning actually worked very, very well initially for us because we had to establish what our time boxes were. We projected time boxes, and we came up with a tentative plan, but that's a tentative plan only. And we need to determine, will those time boxes work for us? What are the real time boxes? So sprint planning worked very well for that. And it was also a great forum for us to call out the specific technical complexities on the level. So before we even went and built the level, you could have the lead level artist or you could have Dusty in the room, and they would say, wait, the way this level is looking like it's going to be designed, it's going to be particularly expensive for what we're trying to achieve. Maybe we can get about that a different way. And it would let us head a lot of problems off at the pass. But as time went on, as we shifted from pre-production to production, we actually, from a level design perspective, have shifted away from Scrum. Now, we've retained some basic Agile principles that are going to be familiar to you here, like keeping our levels always playable, keeping them always a foundation that we build upon, always doing real work, and emphasizing communication over documentation. But there's a very important few reasons why we've actually shifted away from specific Scrum practices. And the main Scrum practice we've shifted away from is picking specific sprint goals, because we found we can't actually live with it. And the reason is that levels are the window to the entire game. And we find that we get blocked very easily by other Scrum teams, other sprint teams, if they don't have something that's ready, if their plans change. So what we would find is maybe a creature isn't ready, maybe a placeable isn't ready, maybe there's a game system that has gotten broken temporarily, and any one of those things can block us on our levels. And if we stuck to specific sprint goals, we would churn on that level and churn on it, and we try and get at it from a different way, but we know that we'd be adding a lot of extra risk to trying to answer those questions. So instead what we do is we take on overall release goals, and really in the form of how much work are we going to complete within this release in order to stay on schedule. So because we have specific time boxes, we know how much work that we can commit to within the release. So our teams, we call them dog piles. And where that comes from is in football, if you have a fumble, a whole bunch of players jump on the ball, they all have a common goal, they all want to get possession of the ball, and sometimes that's referred to as a dog pile, and unfortunately or unfortunately, that one's stuck. So our dog piles, the core part of our dog piles, are level art and level design. We have 3 level designers and 2 level artists per dog pile, 1 senior on each team. Now that's the core. Very frequently we'll have members from other departments coming in, cinematic animation, cinematic design, as necessary based on the phase. But the core of the team that never changes is level art, level design, and QA. Now, like Scrum, we have product owners, and we do have reviews. But for us, our product owner really sets the priority for us in terms of which levels do we want to work on roughly, and roughly the order we want to work on them. But when it comes to actually signing off our work, that's the level review. And at the level review, you can see in the image up on the screen, that's a level review right there. In order to get sign-off, we need to get sign-off from our entire leads team. So that's the art director, the project director, the lead designer, the lead cinematic animator. There's a lot of people who are in that room. So you can imagine that creates some challenges for us. Even just scheduling the meeting is difficult enough. But it actually brings a lot of value, because when you get a level signed off at a certain phase, having all those individuals in the room, you get a lot of buy-in across the board. And you also get some great creative input from those members of the team when they're evaluating a level for, is it achieving the great story we're looking for? Is the combat what we need it to be? Is it creating essentially the experience that we want? Now, one thing that's critical from a production perspective coming out of these meetings is, what are the next steps? Because you can imagine there are ideas flying everywhere in these meetings, and it is critical to know where you stand. So you need to know, has this level been approved? Yes or no? Or are we going to iterate on it? And if we're going to iterate, we need to know exactly what are the items we're going to iterate upon before we come back to another level review. Or maybe it's been approved, but you still don't want to lose all that great feedback from the meeting, and so you're going to make sure everybody's on board with what are you going to do when you take it to the next phase. Now, like I said, because these can be pretty expensive meetings, one of the things we do to try and save some of that cost up front is to do at-desk previews, or maybe it should be called at-desk pre-reviews. And what we'll have is our lead designer or lead level designer go to the individual's desk early on in the time box and take a look at the level and course correct a few things and get some of the main iteration out of the way early. So by the time we get to this meeting, we have a pretty good idea that we're at least on track with it. So now let's look at what has been working for us. Well, most definitely the pairing of level art and level design as a core has really, really worked well. It definitely has some incredible advantages over the whole silo mentality. And we co-locate the teams. So not only are they paired as a team, but they're paired together in a room. So if a level artist can turn to a level designer and say, I'm about to make these changes, and we share collision, so whenever I'm going to make this one, does that work for you? The level designer can say, well, no, hold it. I'm just about to make this change. What if you do that instead? So immediately we get the integration work gets dropped down. We've seen an improvement in quality for the levels. And overall, what it also facilitates is a great common vision, an ongoing vision that they share. Time boxing has been working very, very well for us so far. Well, maybe if we come back and do a full postmortem, we'll give you the full rundown at the end. But so far, it's working very well. And the benefit that it has for us is once you have time boxes that you know you can live within, it makes scheduling and planning pretty straightforward. Because now you know you have a certain number of levels, you have your phases. With time boxes, you have a certain number of teams. You can project out pretty easily where you're going to land. As long as you're sticking to your time boxes and your iterations work within them, you know where you're going to land at the end. Now, one thing that we found we need to do is we need to go deep with some levels. And what we mean by that is there's this natural tendency to want to just kind of march forward one step at a time with your levels. Let's take everything to narrative overview. Now let's take everything to narrative playable. But that's problematic because every time we bust through a new phase, we run into new problems. There's some brick wall that we run into which blocks that team. And it represents problems that we need to get resolved. So we want to go deep with levels. We want some teams to be the tip of the spear, take their levels deep all the way to the end, and find those problems so we can get them resolved early. You know, the worst thing we could do is march all of our teams into the next phase with their levels and all get blocked at once. Then there's no grabbing a level off the hopper and say, okay, we'll just work on this one for a while. That doesn't work. And the other thing about this actually also is until you go deep with a number of levels, you're not going to be confident in all of your time boxes. You don't want to be confident in the first few. So you have to experience each time box and a number of times, not the first time, a number of times in order to narrow it down as tight as you can make it, but still hit your quality level, and then be confident with your overall schedule. So proving out content and systems in-game, this has also worked very, very well for us. It is much better than the test levels until we get the creatures, the placeables into the level in the context with which they're going to be used. We really, really don't know that they're going to work. Otherwise, we're back on that original plan that we had potentially for Mass Effect, where we had some assets that would be created to be put up on the pantry shelf, and at some point, the level designer would turn around and grab it and put it in his level, and what's this? He'd put it in the level, and it may not work the way he wants. And in the worst case, what you can run into is we may not have enough time to actually make the changes in order to make it work. Or potentially even worse, maybe we start undoing geometry from that. And those are problems that we want to avoid at all costs. So I've talked before about one of the ways that we've used to actually resolve blockages is we don't commit to specific levels. What we'll commit to is a complete set of work for the release with planned levels. And if we get blocked, what we'll do is we'll log that time in the time box and grab the next level off the hopper and work on it. Sometimes there isn't a next level in the hopper. Maybe you're blocked on a number. So another method that we've used in order to continue our progress is to just evaluate sections of levels. So if we were, for example, taking a level to orange box, and maybe the boss creature wasn't ready yet, what we might say is, all right, let's take everything up to the boss battle to orange. We'll select a portion of the time box and get that iterated upon and approved. And then what that'll mean is once that's approved, you don't touch it until hardening. Now we call this being agile with our agile process. And just the basic concept of it is we don't ever want process to get in the way of a good workflow. Now, Dusty mentioned this one. We found it's very, very important for us to stop and assess the big picture. And the reason being, all of our level reviews are done in isolation. We get a team of senior individuals into a room. We look at the opening, the level itself, the wrap-up, but it's all in isolation, and we evaluate, is this level great for us? Does it meet the expectations? Is the combat great? Is the story great? But we need to step back and pop your head up and say, does the whole game play the way we want it to play? Does it flow? Does it meet the project director's vision? And as Dusty mentioned, we had an opportunity recently at our Christmas build for everyone to take the build home, give us feedback on it, and then confirm, is this meeting our expectations? The project director could do the same. And really, this isn't possible unless you stick to your foundation, which is all the levels are always playable. Now, the important thing to remember about this is if you do something like this, you're going to add a bunch of work to your product backlog. You're going to get a bunch of feedback in, and your work's going to grow. But it's probably very good work. So what are some of the problems that we've run into along the way? Well, at times we haven't eaten our own dog food, and we've suffered for it. So there were points in times where, for example, these deliverables, we've skipped or missed deliverables. It's caused a problem. So for one level, for example, we tried to take it to narrative playable. We didn't have concept art. And we churned on it about 3 different times, and we weren't any closer to getting it to completion. And what we realized was all those individuals around the room had a different idea of what that level should look like. And I guess it makes sense because form fits function, and it's difficult to build a level when you don't know what the spaces should look like, and they're supposed to fit form. So we got concept art for it. The very next go-around, almost instantly, we got instant traction on it and signed it off very quickly at Narrative Playable, and it actually became our new standard. We ran into the same problem for writing. We tried to push past white box without having white box writing, first pass writing. And the problem we ran into there was when white box writing came in, now we were setting parameters for the writers to solve their problems within. Or even worse, now we'd have to unroll our level so that they could actually write a good level, and we're unwinding our time box. And so again, that's another scenario we really want to avoid at all costs. So every level wants to be, we all want to be special, don't we? I want to be special. Every level wants to be a special snowflake too. And we want these special snowflake moments in our game because it makes a game really fun. And by special snowflake, what we're really referring to is gameplay moments or some aspect, hero pieces that make it more expensive to implement than the average level in the game. But it's just really important for us that we pick and choose these moments. And so I mentioned before why sprint planning was working for us. This is one very important reason. Because we could call out those technical complexities for a level, what's going to turn it into a special snowflake, and make a conscious decision. Is this the special snowflake moment we want at this point? Or no, we're going to solve it in a different method. Because for us, the last thing we want to do is write a check to be a special snowflake on every level, and then maybe we can't cache it. Level team is getting too big. Well, early on we ran into this problem. We had our core, the level art and level design guys, and QA. And if you follow Scrum will tell you should have cross-functional teams. It makes sense for a level to have cinematic animation, cinematic design, visual effects people, audio, across the board. But very, very quickly, your team can grow to a very dysfunctional size, where if you're implementing Scrum, for example, now you're standing around the room in the morning doing your stand-up saying, this is what I completed yesterday, this is what I'm going to complete today. But you get to a point where not everybody cares about everything the last person is talking about. And that's problematic. So for us, sticking to our core and only bringing the specific individuals in at the phases that make sense is what works. Now, in order to coordinate with the other teams and make sure we don't get back into those silos, that's production's job to make sure that we have representatives from each of the other teams at our stand-ups listening and ourselves being at the other stand-ups. So creatures being representative early. This is another really big one for us. That it's very difficult to build a space because we like to build spaces for the creatures for combat. And if you don't know the size of the creature, if you don't know how it's going to move, if you don't know whether it takes cover, if you don't know its AI, it's very difficult to build a space around it. So getting creatures in early, you don't need final art, but they have to be representative for their AI, their combat, their movement, their size. So now let's reflect back on Mass Effect 1, because Mass Effect 1 was why we took on this new iterative level design process. And we have to recognize that Mass Effect 1 was a new intellectual property. There was new technology, it has its own set of challenges, and Mass Effect 2, we have a number of those challenges already resolved. Now, that said, yes, we still feel that this process would have brought us some value, but it would have brought us value in different ways because we would have had to ask different questions. Dusty talked about Calston. There was that hub level with a number of missions off of it. Calston, for example, would have had eyes on it earlier. Based on our new phase process at narrative overview and narrative playable, we would have had eyes on it and had an opportunity to either course correct it and maybe change some writing, or maybe we would have changed the geometry of the level, or maybe we would have put a bolt in the brain pan and said, done, that one's done. We're going to spend our time on something else. But we would have invested less on that level. Definitely, we've seen integration value through less integration work with our new process, so that definitely would have carried over to Mass Effect 1. And finally, if you played Mass Effect, how many people have played Mass Effect 1? Oh, wow, that's great. Wow, and if you haven't played Mass Effect 1, you should play Mass Effect 1. No, like now, you should go and get it and play it right now. Well, if you played it, then you probably have experienced, we had a little bit of hitching on the Citadel, for example. There was maybe loading on the elevators was a little long. But based on the new process that we had, I mean, we are always focusing on keeping to those performance budgets at each phase. And we have to recognize, I mean, we did some code drops later in the process that would have prevented us from being able to resolve some of these optimization issues early. But based on this phase process, the moment that we could have resolved them, we would have had to address them. Instead of taking the focus which we did on ME1, which was, let's get the content in all together, and then we're going to optimize at the end. So we definitely feel we would have been able to resolve some of these problems. So we want to leave you with our main message, which is, for us, it has been very important to do only the work that answers the right questions in the right order. Now, at Bioware, we strive to make the best story-driven games in the world. So these are our phases, and these are our questions and how we try to answer them. So if you're going to use a process like this, probably the best thing is to ask yourself what your core focus is and what would your questions be. So that's our presentation for today. I hope you liked it. And if you have questions, we'll do our best to answer them.
Thank you.
Oh, just a second. Is that microphone on, Kelly?
Hello?
There you go. There we go.
So you mentioned that you paired level art and level design in teams. You didn't mention programmers. Were they not part of the teams? How did you do that?
Okay. At one point, I had mentioned that we would bring members from other teams on as we needed them or as it made sense. And we actually did bring programmers on, and the most common time that we would bring programmers onto the teams was when we would bust through new phases, when we would go deep, run into potential problems with systems that needed to get resolved, and then we would get programming involved. Yeah, but it was on an as-needed basis.
Yeah, kind of case by case, we'd have an embedded programmer. Like our cinematics team actually has a embedded programmer for their work that helps them out with that. And like, for example, we had one time where we had some performance problems that we really needed to hammer through. So we kind of got, in essence, a scrum, which was a level design scrum. It was focused on a specific level, getting into performance. We brought programmers in. So it's all about being agile.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What happens when something goes wrong? You're in the third or fourth phase, someone just missed something major, and you have to go back and move a door or add a window or move a box or something.
Are you saying what happens if it looks like we're going to miss our time box?
No, what happens if you have to go back to a previous stage and move something that you'd finalized that you just screwed up?
Sure.
Because, that does come up. Because we don't want to make sure that this is like so constrained that you can't make a good game. And that does happen every once in a while. But it's all about the time box. And you look at it, and especially since you have level designer and level artist sitting together, which is usually where those kind of things come from, you can look around and say, hey, I'd like to do this. What would the impact be? And the answer has to be, well, I could do that within my time box, no problem. And usually it's also, depending what the change is, and let me get Preston and Dusty in here to see if they're okay with it. If it's something that's major. If it's something that doesn't fit within the time box, then we look at it hard and we go, well, is it good enough, or do we actually now have to get rid of something else to do that? But it does come up.
Makes sense. Thank you.
And it's important to remember also that every once in a while we will not hit a time box. It is possible that some will go over. But on the other hand, we also come under on others as well. So we'll make the time back if we can.
So in a perfect world, in pre-production, you would figure out all your mechanics. However, in reality, sometimes some of those mechanics need to change. They go late. Now, you guys are on a sequel, so hopefully most of your mechanics are set. But what do you do when, hey, you came up with this new mechanical idea, and you've completed the first level where the tutorial is, for example. So now you have it at the hardening stage, but you need to retrofit something in there that was never planned for. Like, how do you handle those kind of cases where you need to be kind of agile and on your feet?
Okay, and I think what that gets at really is, what are your questions? So in that case, you may not have the exact same questions we have for a specific level. You're going to have a different question that you need to answer, and maybe at a certain point. So you have to decide, what's the earliest point that we need to answer that? What's the minimum set? And it may be that before you're doing pacing and spacing, maybe you have to answer, how's that game mechanic going to work?
Okay.
Right?
I can also add on to that. We kind of purposely, for the ones that we go deep on, tried to pick the not important levels. So we didn't go deep on the beginning or the end of the game, which lets us then say, okay, because some things do come down the pipe, and I think Cory even mentioned about the growth that you move forward, is that we might say, oh, now there's this new thing, and we've learned something more. Let's apply it going forward. And then on the ones that it's missing, we question and say, is it required there? And do we have to deal and react? Or do we say, no, it was good enough, so it might be missing here. But so in theory, we'll hope and we'll see what happens, is that the levels that we do at the very end will be the best levels. And you always want a little sprinkling of good.
Okay, thank you.
So you mentioned you didn't always have strict sprint goals because sometimes one area was a little behind for one reason or another. I wondered if you had thought about adopting Kanban for scheduling.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last part.
Kanban.
Kanban.
Yeah, Kanban for scheduling to get a little bit of flexibility without having it, go wildly two teams going wildly out of sync.
Sure, and for everybody, Kanban it's very related to Lean, and it's definitely a process that we're considering. There are other groups in EA actually that use Kanban, but we're not using it right now. It may be something that we're going to investigate for the future.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
So you previously mentioned the involvement of QA and how they were basically bottlenecked by not having a playable version. So did you basically have QA doing full testing passes even at the earliest stages and basically filing bugs against incomplete content, or did you try and delay those full QA passes until later when you knew
we
it was ready?
Based on the deliverables that we have at each phase, there are specific QA test suites that we have that we can test at each phase, and we don't want to put off testing our game or validating our game. We will test as much as we possibly can at each level.
Right,
so
thank you.
That was actually something that we didn't bring up here, but a very big advantage of the phase thing is that it actually let QA know what they could do bugs against, which is a really big problem. When you're halfway through, QA's filing bugs, and we're like, we haven't done that yet. Why are you giving us these bugs? That was something that really hit us hard on ME1. It's going much better now on ME2 because it's like, oh, I know I could file a bug against this. It's spelled out. We know what our deliverables are. So that's actually a great question.
As it relates to bugs in the agile process, how have you guys integrated bug tracking and reporting into, sprint planning and the committed backlog? How do you make sure you're looking at the whole picture and not just doing new feature development all the time?
That's a really good question. And for us, we take more of we'll go back to almost a Scrum approach, and we'll say by the end of each, because there are sprints going on throughout our project, right? There is this heartbeat that a lot of other sprint teams, in fact, pretty much everyone other than level design is following sprint to sprint. And what we will do is we're going to say for level creation, we want no bugs, medium or higher, by the end of each sprint. So in addition to the time box work, we always have to beat our bugs down,
So at the start of a sprint, are you looking at user stories and bugs that were previously reported at the end of the last sprint?
Nope, because we don't take on specific sprint goals. We have overall release objectives, a certain amount of work, and we have a rough plan of what we're going to work on. But we don't say specifically, well, we're going to actually take on less work because it looks like there's more bugs. Because built into the concept of our time box right now is enough time to be validated or to be resolving our bugs. So we just go with the ongoing basis that every 3 weeks we have to make sure that we are down to 0 bugs.
Cool. Thanks.
I've got a QA question too. I was just curious how many QA guys you have per those teams, the dog piles?
1 to 2.
1 and 2?
Yeah.
One for each, or?
1 to 2 for each level creation team.
I see.
Yeah.
Nice.
And then we have other ones that kind of have a global kind of, like someone looks at
Overall,
stories, someone looks at
qualitative.
combat, actually. So there's even more on the side.
That's
We have
really
we have
nice.
one we have one that specifically validates level art, for example. Yeah. So,
Luxury. Thanks.
I may be asking too much about possible release date.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Possible release date.
Possible release. Well, I think actually that's
it's
been
been
announced,
announced.
right? Isn't that?
Oh, really?
Yeah, early next year.
Yeah.
Only next year. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
You bet.
2 questions. One is what project management tools are you using, and the other is how do you go about doing capacity? Do you put everyone at 80%, leads at 60%?
Project. Well, that's a little.
Do you use
beyond
Handsoft or?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we are right now using Handsoft. We're giving that a test, and we're just evaluating whether it's going to work for us or not.
Okay. And then do you put people at 80% capacity? So
no, we don't actually use it that way because, in fact, that's potentially a problem for us. Is that something like Handsoft, for example? It's very Scrum, but time boxing is not something that it tracks, right? It's not going to track how much time you have left. What it tracks is, like the standard Scrum, as a snapshot, how much work do we have left, not how much have I eaten into my time box. So we have to make sure and track our time boxes, and we actually do that separately.
Okay. So on a typical day, is it you plan an 8-hour day? Is it 6 hours of work or 5 hours of work?
Well, and again, that's kind of back to how much time do we have based on task, and what we look at more is how much overall calendar time do we have to get this level to the specific phase. And so we're not looking at tracking people's individual time or their, how much time went to the specific task. We did that very, very early, for sprint planning. But at this point, that's more of a hands-off of how are we doing on our time box? Do we look like we're trending? But we're not going hour to hour.
Okay,
thanks. We've only brought in voice actors to the studio twice for any given game. Once to do the first cut, and then once to, fix up anything that we screwed up. Do you have to bring them in more often than that because levels are being finalized at different times?
Well, actually, we do it all externally, so we don't bring them in. We actually go down to Hollywood and have that all done, and it's all magic that happens that way. But what we're doing is that it depends on the character, actually. So smaller characters, we make sure we get it right. It goes, and we usually don't do a re-record after that. That's why we really make sure that the dialogue's solid. For our more, widespread characters, they get actually many, many times. In part, that's so much dialogue, I don't think they could do it in one shot. But also, it's like they get reworks over.
Yeah, we'll do pickup sessions.
Yeah. So we'll do pickup sessions all the way up until the end.
Cool.
Oh, hi. I just wondered at which phases, if any, you do external focus tests or play tests.
So we do. And we're just starting and getting really in swing with it. That we do focus testings over lunch, and it's almost at every stage. The thing is, we're just really kind of getting used to making sure that we don't bias ourselves since there's a lot of imagination that goes in. So we could do it, and I think we have done it at like a white box. We tend to try orange box as the real answer you're looking for. We tend to come in an orange box, and that's when you get the really good feedback because everything's there. But in theory, you could actually have you get the feedback earlier. But you look for what they're looking for. But we haven't really investigated that as much. We'd have
to be careful with that because with what you're saying, which is if we were to do it earlier, we just have to be careful with the data that's coming back. Are you getting feedback on elements you haven't even worked on yet as deficiencies?
There's real value early on, but it's also really open to bias.
Yeah, so that's very much what the Bungie talk on the testing was about.
Right.
Starting very early, but careful about what you ask.
Right.
Yeah,
Wow,
well, I think that looks like everything. So thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for coming.